Okay, so this is our conversation with Amanda Achtman, and we will begin in 3, 2, and 1.
I'm Deacon Eric.
And I'm Dr. Brett Salkeld.
And you're listening to Thinking Faith. This is a podcast brought to you by the Archdiocese of Regina, where we attempt to navigate this winding road of faith in Jesus Christ so that we might know Him more intimately, love Him more profoundly, and together serve Him more deeply in our daily lives.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Thinking Faith. Very happy to have the wonderful Amanda Achtman in studio with us here today at the start of really a week of fabulous activities. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a joy to be here.
Yeah,
this is our first guest in studio.
This is, yeah. So you're, second guest. I had Dr. David Capriva in.
Well, I was out. Well, what do I know?
Well, you were out.
Never mind.
And actually, you'll get to meet Dr. Dave later this week. Yeah, so it was a great, actually, we did it as kind of a prelude to having you in the diocese.
Great.
And that's so, yeah.
Well, so tell us a little bit about how you came to us. Why you're not from the Archdiocese of Regina, so how did we get you in studio and in the diocese for this this episode and this week?
Sure. I'm from Calgary and I live in Ottawa. Most of the time, though, I'm traveling all around Canada and even around the world as part of my mission to prevent euthanasia and encourage hope. This is the mission that God has put on my heart, and step by step, it has become what I dedicate the majority of my time to. So having conversations every single day about suffering, death, meaning, and hope, and having really meaningful encounters where this issue of our euthanasia crisis in Canada has become a basis for the kind of evangelization to which I'm called in our culture right now.
Mm-hmm. It's that particular approach that you have, as you talked about, through meaning and purpose and hope, that I think is particularly refreshing to bring into these kinds of conversations. And we're going to touch on that. But so can you say a little bit about what brought you into this kind of field? I know that you had some involvement in politics early on. But how did you make that bridge into this unique area of evangelization?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, one of my favorite quotations from St. Edith Stein is that vocation is better understood in retrospect. It really only makes sense when we trace the history of our life, God's providence in it, the relationships and encounters and events that lead to what she calls a climax. And this feels a bit like that, where it's only in retrospect that I can kind of make sense of what led me as a relatively young person to focus on end-of-life issues in this way. And there are many things. I would say one of them is the fact that when I was young, very young, just 2 years old, I had a baby brother who died.
Okay.
He was 7 months and he spent almost his whole life in the hospital. And since he died so young, and since I didn't grow up getting to know him while he was alive, my parents really wanted to make sure that we would remember him. And so we had a lot of means of commemoration of his short life. We had, for example, a handprint that was made while he was alive, and this kind of handprint kind of thing that we would keep on the wall of his, we would bring it into any family photo of him so that we remembered him in that way in our family photos. We would do a scrapbook, and we'd pull out the scrapbook about Brandon, and we would decorate it and color it on the anniversary of his birthday into earth and his birthday into heaven. And the other thing is, my parents were really into home video. And so thankfully, we have home video of his baptism, a day in the life in the hospital, and of his funeral. And when I was a little kid, I watched these videos over and over. I was very interested in them. And it might seem strange that a kid wanted to watch videos of her brother's funeral, but for me, it was this age-appropriate way of getting to know this brother who I lost. So that's one. Another big influence was my grandfather, and my grandfather came to Canada just before the Second World War, and he was a Polish Jew. So he came to Canada in 1937, thankfully, and he lost his faith because of the Holocaust. All of his extended family perished in the Holocaust. And so I grew up as a young person with a great sensitivity to evil and to dehumanization. And he challenged me to face up to this dehumanization of the past, and that caught my attention about dehumanization today. So living with my grandfather, because he moved in with my family for my high school and university years, it was in those years that he was in his 80s and 90s. And it was during that time that our government started talking about euthanasia.
Yeah.
Euthanasia for people whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable. And since I had such a warm relationship with my grandfather, I really did. He was my intellectual sparring partner. We went on dates, always to Italian restaurants, so he would have approved of my decision to go study in Rome, for sure, if only for the food focus. And so he really challenged me. He encouraged me to study the Holocaust, to face up to the details that had so distressed and challenged his faith. And I really loved him. I mean, I don't know what my parents would think of this, but I love the quotation that the reason why grandparents and grandchildren get along so well is because they share a common enemy. And I really felt this great closeness with my grandfather, and then saw this discussion about legalizing euthanasia for people whose deaths are reasonably foreseeable as, first and foremost, an affront on the elderly and a devaluation of the lives of the elderly. And I realized a lot of people don't have their grandparents in their lives in such a pronounced way as I do. So maybe I'm capable of seeing what a gift he is in a way that others don't see. And so he died a natural death the year before Canada legalized euthanasia. He was my last grandparent, and he died in 2015. And so these experiences all contributed to my formation in a really profound way. And after his death, I actually moved to Poland. I studied John Paul II for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
I decided to visit a former concentration camp every Friday for 3 hours to think about death of the victims at Majdanek, and my own death while I was in my 20s. And for me, all of this was really natural because I had this sense of the gravity of life. I think growing up with a sense of Holocaust history, there's the sense of, why do I get to be here? And almost only geography and years
And time,
separate me from that fate. And that just made me feel hyper responsible, hyper conscientious. Even coming back from that Holocaust study trip, I would wake up and think, why do I get to wake up today? And it would summon me to this intense responsibility. So yeah, these are some of the factors that in retrospect, I can trace God's providence in bringing me to this vocation to combat dehumanization in our time through promoting life.
Wow.
A couple ideas that really jumped out at me that I want to throw back at you and see what you think. See if I can keep them all straight. One is reasonably foreseeable is a heck of a phrase.
Yeah.
Because everyone's death is reasonably foreseeable. But of course, as you zeroed in on, it says something very particular about the value of the life of the elderly or otherwise sort of terminally, more obviously approaching the end of life, right? A second thought is your relationship with your grandfather and the kind of hyper conscientiousness or sense of responsibility. I wonder, a big factor, it seems to me, nowadays, is families that drift further and further apart. My wife was helping a young Vietnamese priest here work on his English accent. And so she was just a conversation partner with him. And he said he was visiting an elderly person in a care facility here in Regina whose family lives in Moose Jaw, so that's 45 minutes away, and hadn't visited in 5 years. And this Vietnamese seminarian was just incensed that how could you live 45 minutes away and not visit your family? And so I think that's one layer of the conscientiousness thing is just you haven't put the time into the relationship. And then the second thing I think related to that is I feel like your attention to your own inner life and what that means for like being here on earth for a limited amount of time. It strikes me that as a culture, we're basically numbing ourselves to that reality with our relationship with screens, video, social media. There's all kinds of ways that we just don't spend any time thinking about what we're doing here. We're more like, it feels like we're like literally killing time. And so I just wonder how those themes seem to emerge in your story there. And I wonder if you want to elaborate more on those. So those are really interesting to me.
So many good dimensions you draw on there. The phrase killing time is interesting. In a sense, euthanasia is the peak of killing time. You're killing the time that a person has left. You're destroying whatever remains in the sort of hourglass of that life that would be left to be lived and that is given. And when you have a sensitivity of the preciousness of human life and such a desire to safeguard it, we all have people for whom we fought and for whom it would be devastating to lose them in a natural way. And we kill all that potential of those grace-filled times when death is prematurely hastened through euthanasia and or suicide. And so that's one thing. About the story of the Vietnamese priest, it's reminding me of an anecdote that Pope Francis told. Pope Francis is very much focused on the themes of intergenerational solidarity, the symphony between generations, he calls it. He gave a series of Wednesday audiences on the meaning and value of aging in Scripture. 18 Wednesday audiences, a sort of theology of aging that he expounded, which the church has yet to mine the richness of this true gem of his pontificate, in my opinion. And in one of the addresses that Pope Francis gave, he spoke about when he was a priest in Argentina visiting a woman in a nursing home. And he asked this woman, does your family come and visit you? She said, oh, yes, they come very often. And when he left the room, the medical professionals and caregivers said, it's not true. They don't come. And he was so shaken and jolted by that. And he said, oh, this is a sin. And he had this similar kind of indignation over it, and that she had said that for whatever reason, and that it wasn't really true, and that the visits were so seldom. So we also can glean something of those who are separated from their families. We have, of course, so many immigrants and refugees for whom it's a serious cross to be so far away from their family members and what they would give to kind of have the proximity with them. And yet, as we know, sometimes the proximity can be its own challenge. And there's a reason why in-laws living with families, it's not always a straightforward project. So these things are very challenging. I think another thing that Pope Francis is pointing us to is that we need to cultivate a more expansive vision of family. It's very important to have, hopefully, intergenerational bonds within the nuclear family that can be good. And yet, in addition to that, where is the sort of intergenerational community more broadly than family, strictly speaking? And I think he's trying to help us broaden our horizon in this regard. Yes, I had my grandfather in my life, and yet when I think about it, I have had so many people who are like grandparents to me, elderly friends, people who have so formed and raised me, who weren't and aren't related to me. I think of the 2 Holocaust survivors with whom I traveled on the March of Remembrance and Hope when I was 18. Those 2 survivors, Fegi and Pinhas, are forever a part of my story in one of the most decisive ways. They gave me things that my family could not give because those were not their exact experiences. Even my grandfather, who left and came before the war, did not have the experience of survival that these survivors did. And their faith, these 2 survivors with whom I traveled and with whom I was facing up to the loss of faith that my grandfather had put to me as a challenge and confrontation. Well, for them, they persevered in their Jewish identity and in their faith in God and in their sense of responsibility of being survivors to return to these places and bear witness for the rising generations. And so there are many people, though, beyond that. I think we have so much to glean, and yet in our culture, we really kind of ghettoize the generations. And so we're not having this constant contact. And that lack of familiarity is also something to attend to, especially because not everyone in their natural families or nuclear families has the ease of connecting with relatives who will give them life. We speak about the value of the elderly sometimes as consisting in their wisdom. And Pope Francis likes to be emphatic on how much we can grow in faith. But what if the older person is not particularly wise and not particularly faithful? Not that we have nothing to learn from each person. I think each person is an image bearer from whom we can glean something and have an encounter. And yet we need to go and seek, like in Sirach, it says, let your feet wear out the doorsteps of the wise.
I love that.
So wherever we find them, wherever we find saints, heroes, martyrs, exemplars, and even people to fill gaps in our lives and in our formation, that can be such a source of richness that we need.
Yeah. I had grandparents that died early on in my life. And just as you're talking, I'm recalling the years that I spent in parish ministry with so many beautiful, wise, elderly grandparent figures that those relationships I still treasure today. Melissa and I will still talk about the bulletin folders that would come on Friday, and we would get together, we'd have coffee and snacks and share life together over just a simple task of sitting around a table and folding bulletins, right? But it's those little things that build relationship and build community. And there are a few moments like that through my time in parish ministry where I recognized these are the moments that are most valuable, most treasured, right? Over and above all of the kind of big things and tasks that you get involved in the life of a parish. It's always those relationship building spaces.
That's so true. And it reminds me of another gem in Pope Francis's thought on this. He speaks about the gestures that the elderly show. For example, older people, when you're visiting them, they just take your hands and hold them. Always. It's almost like a natural sort of reflex. And it's quite beautiful to have your hands held by an older person in this way. And when I think about this, I think it'd be really weird if you did that. I'd be like, what? Like, this is not not what we expect, and rightly so. And yet Pope Francis is pointing to something so profound when he says the gestures that the elderly give and show, such as holding hands like that, are credible to young people.
They are.
He says young people are not capable of showing affection in these ways. And it's true.
And so they give this model, this mentorship of gesture, of affection.
Gestures.
So yesterday, this past weekend was my mom's birthday. She just moved into a new senior facility in town. And we actually went and had dinner with her. She was so excited to have us have dinner in the facility with her and show us around to all of the new friends that she met. And every single one would do exactly that. She'd be like, this is my son, this is my daughter-in-law. And there's this one lady, 94-year-old Italian woman, Rosa, who just grabbed hold of my hands, and I thought she would never let go. And a part of my heart didn't want her to let go, just in that simple gesture.
Yeah. And how much is revealed to us about God's heart for us when we're met with that kind of affirmation, which is unique. And so we need these experiences to provoke what Pope Francis calls the revolution of tenderness. It happens when we have our hands held, but if we eject people from the human community, if we say you no longer have a place of belonging in the world, we lower the kindness quotient because we have not had our hands held like that. We become so existentially impoverished. This is the kind of deprival in which we live now in Canada. And to rehabilitate ourselves and our humanity, we need to, as Pope Francis says, touching and looking at the face of Christ. This is what it means to give one's life. And so let's create those occasions. And part of my being here this week is a week of encounter, and to remind everyone that these encounters are worthwhile. Sometimes they're uncomfortable, sometimes they're awkward. But as this Polish priest in Canada's North said to me, I loved how he put it. He said, sometimes you just have to love awkwardly.
Yes.
Love awkwardly. What a great exhortation. So
in just a second, tell us more about the week of encounter, but as a bit of a setup, just to share an experience in my own family about encounter that I think a lot of people will relate to. If a lot of our contact with people is via social media, we see a very narrow slice of who they are. Social media captures a certain kind of thing, mostly your political opinions, which might be stupid or irresponsible, or at least might appear that way to someone with another point of view, right? And it's very easy when the majority of your encounters are with a person's narrow slice of life that is their political opinions, which may be, influenced by all kinds of different media consumption patterns on their end. And we know how all that works. When you actually meet the people who seem crazy on social media, they're usually not actually crazy, right? And it would be the easiest thing in the world to shield grandchildren from grandparents who have like irresponsible media consumption patterns that show up in their Facebook feed. And it does not mean that they are bad grandparents or any number of other things. And I worry that in families that are divided by politics and other things that is largely expressed through social media, we end up really undermining. And so this goes to what you said about like seeing and touching. Yeah. Like this is the opposite of seeing and touching. This is like seeing through a lens that obscures and then avoiding, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's like, it's the opposite of encounter, I guess is my point. And I think there's a real challenge for us, both intergenerationally, but even just interpersonally, to like overcome, whether that's in families and making sure you spend time together, or whether that's in parishes, where parishes are full of people who have very different Facebook feeds, and let's make some pancakes together on Sunday morning. Yeah. And, like it's the seeing and touching that I think is so much an antidote to this dehumanizing separation that gets introduced when such a narrow slice of who we are becomes the preeminent thing in other people's imaginations of who we are.
That's really good. Yeah, thank you for that. Great point.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a week of encounter.
Yes. So part of what I am doing is traveling around place to place. And that's necessary because while I can communicate certain things online, there's no substitute for coming to a place, staying with the local religious community or apostolate, getting a sense of the issues most touching a community, seeing how people give their lives to Christ in a particular local context is the kind of nourishment that I need to do anything effective in terms of ministry and speaking to these issues. Also seeing the ways in which the issue of euthanasia touches people differently across Canada. There are certainly regional factors at play, demographic dynamics at play. And so it's a big part of the education for me to come to different places and kind of latch on to a local community. And I've started doing this more and more, going to activate and empower a local diocese in preventing euthanasia and encouraging hope. And part of the urgency around that is euthanasia has really caught us all by surprise. It's been legal for almost 10 years, and yet many people who were being formed and prepared for ministry and the faith, maybe it was one class that you took, or maybe it was something in the catechism that you studied, but the pastoral demands pertaining to euthanasia and the extent of the crisis and the new questions that are brought to the fore and the way in which euthanasia is a symptom that represents such a broader crisis of faith and culture, this we have not really been prepared for. And because of its inhumanity, it kind of makes sense that we haven't been prepared for this particular darkness. And yet now it's so important that we become well-formed in the faith on these matters and well-formed, humanly speaking, to address and encounter people who might be contemplating euthanasia, who may be grieving the death of a loved one, who may be shaken by having been called to anoint someone before their death, only to hear that the death is scheduled, new things that weren't happening before. And so I come to accompany the local church and to contend with some of these challenges, to hear people's personal experiences. And it so happens that there's not a time I've spoken, even within the church, where someone doesn't come up to me with a personal experience of euthanasia. And for our American friends or for our friends in the UK and other countries, that's really startling how the prevalence. But with 1 in 20 deaths in Canada being a euthanasia death, with 70,000 Canadians at least having been killed by doctors or nurses since legalization. If we extrapolate how many family members, friends, neighbors, grandchildren, children are included in the toll of euthanasia, it's incalculable. And so I come with an attention to that and a curiosity to how we can live this great wound in our society and in our own hearts together. One thing that I appreciate about this issue is, to me, it is so much not an us and them. It is a we.
Yeah.
It is an us and it is a we. It is a question of our own tendencies and temptations. On the one hand, to self-rejection, which is underlying the question of whether or not it's good to be in the world after all. On the one hand, and our tendency and temptation at times and throughout our lives to discard, dismiss, or discount others. And that's what makes it such a broader field of consideration, and what makes it sufficiently interesting for me to give my life to, because it's really a jumping off point for these deeper existential questions. This is as someone who studied philosophy and worked in politics and did journalism and is alert to the Holocaust. To me, it's such a natural convergence of all of these topics in one. So I give thanks to God for this mission and for extending the mission field to include the diocese here in Regina. And that's kind of how it's unfolding so far.
I love that you spoke earlier about this work as work of evangelization.
Yeah.
Because I think very often we think, well, evangelization is like tell people about Jesus. And then like, okay, then there's also ethical questions. So we need to make our case in public policy or whatever else around what the law should look like. And we'll make ethical questions. And we might bring in stories that make the point. But very often we neglect to make the connection to like, when you encounter the people, when you accompany, which in some circles, accompaniment has been framed as like an alternative to evangelization, even though I think most of us realize that's a false dichotomy. But when you frame this in terms of evangelization, I find that really interesting, and it might also make sense for people about why you're like here to speak at a youth rally. Like, okay, so we're having the assisted suicide person come speak at our youth rally. So are they getting an ethics lecture? What's going on? Well, obviously not just an ethics lecture, something about evangelization. So I'd love for you to develop the relationship between this work and evangelization.
Yeah.
And the youth event.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to the youth rally and planning to speak about finding mission in life. And that's something with which we're all concerned. And I can speak a little bit to the trajectory that has led me to my sense of mission with an eye to helping them discern their own. I remember when I was the age of the youth rally attendees, when I was in high school, and a youth minister said that your vocation is where your passion intersects with the needs of the world. And I thought about that. And at the time, I remember thinking, okay, passion, what I'm good at, what comes easily to me, what makes me come alive and feel awake. Where my passion intersects with the needs of the world, I'll go find something to attend to in this way. But of course, as I grew step by step in the faith, I learned and realized the way in which passion means to suffer, to undergo. And that was a shift, because then I started to wonder, well, where does what I suffer and undergo intersect with the needs of the world? How does my weakness, what I'm not good at, what my friends are struggling with, what I find most painful, how does that intersect with the needs of the world? And how do my wounds lead to my mission and bespeak something of what I'm called to do? I love how Pope Francis, in speaking to young people, he says a lot of times it's natural for young people to consider the question, who am I? And okay, fair enough. Who am I is a reasonable question for us in youth to look up and out and ask. And he says, though, a more mature question to which we can come is the question, for whom am I? For whom am I? And this is so important, because if all of our emphasis is on who am I, a question of identity, then we're not necessarily led to the question of meaning and mission, which is only in relation to the other. Like John Paul II says, his favorite line in Gaudium et Spes was, man can only find himself and fulfill himself through a sincere gift of self. And who am I may not be enough of a question, even if you find the answer, to securely bring you to the question of the gift of self that you were called to make. So these are the things with which I've grappled personally, and that's pretty much what I think I'll have to share and unpack with them. And I also want to point them to examples of young saints. It's also something Pope Francis loves to do. Highlighting young saints as prophets of change is how he speaks about them, and especially Blessed Carlo Acutis.
Yeah.
And I love Blessed Carlo's story. I think there's so much to his life and witness for people of all ages. He is really an example for our time and has become a real friend to me in my own spiritual life and in my life of advocacy and mission. So I do very much look forward to introducing Carlo as a close friend of mine, and the ways in which I've come to know him deeply, much more deeply than, he was a kid who made websites and was a good person. No. There's so much more. Carlo said he never wasted time doing anything that was not pleasing to God. And he died when he was 15.
Yeah.
And he limited himself not on social media, but on video games to an hour a week of video games, self-imposed limit. He is present in our lives and in our faith to coach us in so many of the virtues and habits that we're all struggling to cultivate, of limits with technology, of outward goingness, the way that he attended to the needs of the poor. Also, Carlo was very cool because he was not raised in a religious family. His mother even says that before she gave birth to Carlo, she'd been to Mass 3 times in her life.
In her life.
In her entire life. And so Carlo had this really incredible awakening to the truths of the faith, and then eventually evangelized his parents and beyond so much more deeply. He teaches us so many things: how to live, how to die, how to attend to the needs of others in a way that becomes a basis for meaning, how to spend time before the Blessed Sacrament so that it isn't boring. Like, it's so cool to kind of grow up with him. I was born the exact same year as him too, so I feel like such a kinship with Carlo, and I'm super excited for his canonization.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's so great that you'll be able to share that with our young people here. My own kids are going to go, so I'm excited that they're going to go. And I think the longer trajectory, the connection with your main passion project, right? The euthanasia question, I think is so insightful, because if our young people live in a world that says something like, congratulations, you get to make your own meaning, which means something like anything you come up with could have been different. You could change it tomorrow, etc. Then you have nothing you can rest in. You have no object to strive for. You are your own standard, which actually leads to meaninglessness. And then I guess video games will make you able to not stare into the abyss. So let's give that 5 hours a day instead of 1 hour a week, or whatever the thing is, right? And then the question of, once I'm facing a terminal illness, or once someone in my family is facing a terminal illness, what is life all about? Well, life wasn't really about anything, actually. Yeah. So why bother, right? But if instead, from the time you're young, you have a sense of the purpose of life that is ordered to gift of self, something beyond yourself, then actually suffering and death can be a beautiful part of a life well lived, and not like a weird waste at the end that seems incomprehensible. Yeah. So I mean, the connection between this talk for the young people and the social conditions and basic presuppositions that so many of us take on without even really thinking about it, that comes down to things like how you choose to use your time on a Saturday afternoon. Anyways, just to make some of those connections as they appeared to me while you were talking.
Absolutely. And when I think about pro-life issues in high school that had my attention, I was more focused on beginning of life issues as a high schooler. And yet those issues completely captured my attention, and bioethics became an interest as early as junior high school. I remember when I was in grade 7 and I saw fetal models for the first time, and I was very taken by learning the science of human development, and these were stepping stones to the defense of life in all stages that I have now. And there's so many touch points, and there's so many ways in which these issues are already touching young people. And so there's no basis for exclusion from the deeply human questions. There's always a way to approach them in each season of life, and people are deeply worthy of it. And when we look at Carlo, he was 15 and he was contending with the mystery of suffering, death, life with God in heaven, a lot of deep things. And you don't always get to choose when these issues confront you. Yeah. So I think it's never too early to initiate people in a life of depth. It can certainly be too late, but we all need to eschew the kind of triviality and superficiality of which you were speaking, so that we can come alive and come awake. And so I'm really excited that the theme for the youth rally is choose adventure. And I want to also spread the message to people of all ages and stages of life. Your life is an adventure until your last breath. It's not like the choose adventure theme is only pertinent for the young people. And sometimes I like to imagine flipping. What if I spoke about a topic that I usually speak about in retirement homes with the high schoolers? And what if I brought the themes with which I usually speak to junior high and high school students to the elderly? Themes for young people are often, what are you looking forward to? How can you make a gift of yourself? How can you be set on fire? What's your mission? Well, in fact, everyone is a protagonist of their life and has the ability to have those questions addressed to them as long as they live. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's kind of playful.
No, but I imagine even if you don't actually give the talk in the opposite context, it informs the way you approach the talk that you do give.
Exactly.
To have done that sort of thought experiment.
Right.
Yeah.
And builds those bonds of intergenerational solidarity, because I actually think that these issues are a basis for connecting across generations. Because sometimes when I speak to younger people on the topic of euthanasia, I've spoken this way more so with college students, but I discuss euthanasia as a form of self-harm. Mm-hmm. And put in those terms, there's something that younger people, I understand and identify in a more pronounced way. And yet it's so emphatically the case. And similarly to the older people, I would say, what message do you have to say, or what witness do you have to give to a young person who is struggling or tempted to harm themselves if you go through with this euthanasia death?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's a powerful approach. I mean, I can see, so one of the areas of diaconal ministry that I'm involved in, that my wife and I are involved in, is in the area of mental health. And that whole issue of self-harm as an inroad to these kinds of discussions, I could see having a lot of value and a lot of touch points in the lives of young people, in the lives of their parents who are so often journeying with them, kind of lost in knowing how do I walk with my son or my daughter who's struggling with these kinds of things, and to recognize that there are conversations around value, purpose, meaning, and hope that this context of euthanasia and its proposed expansions, even in Canada too, can open up. Those are surprising areas of hope to find in this context, which is one of the things that I appreciate most about your approach, is looking for that hope in the midst of what seems like a devastating and hopeless situation.
Yes, there's always hope in every conversation, and a big part of it with which you can both identify is in the communion that comes through sharing and bearing these crosses. I think a lot of times if we cannot bear wounds in our culture and in our lives, and it's because we're not bearing those wounds. in this sense of revealing and showing our vulnerability to others.
Yeah.
We cannot bear what we have not borne and things like this. And just a brief story kind of connected to this. I recently went for coffee with a woman, a granddaughter, whose grandmother was euthanized. And when this granddaughter spoke to me, she's just a few years younger than me, she said, my grandmother was the height of strength in our family, the ultimate matriarch. She was so tough, and everyone in the family knew it. In September, she opted for MAID. This woman said to me, if she broke in this way, then I, she said, who struggle with depression, ADD, mental health challenges, then I don't stand a chance.
Yeah.
That was the crippling kind of toll. And thank God this young woman does stand a chance. She's in a good community of faith and has good supports now and is sharing this story and wants it to be shared in a way that will be for the life of the world. And I think that the other thing that I've found so meaningful and so hope-filled in the stories that I'm able to tell of others through video interviews, through people willing to share their stories so transparently in short films, is that people, by bearing witness and giving testimony, are able to make their loved one's life and death more fruitful than that person knew how. And that is a form of redemption of their story, even in this life. And if by testimony and witness and bearing that vulnerability so nobly for the benefit of others can be a glimmer of redemption, then how much more can God redeem all these things? Yeah. And so, of course, we hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wonder, we're probably getting close to the end of episode 1.
Yeah.
And so maybe now is the time we're going to come back for episode 2, so we're going to get more of this. And the plan for episode 2 is to share some of these stories. So maybe we can put a wrap on episode 1 by telling us, you said you've got this video ministry. You're doing these interviews and whatever. Tell us how we can find them, maybe even how we might participate, maybe in our life or our story. We would like to talk to you. We would like to share something from our experience. So where can we find these? Where can we get in touch with you? And then when we come back next week, we'll actually dig into some more of the good stories you're sharing.
Great, thanks. So people can go to dyingtomeetyou.com. Dyingtomeetyou.com is the website where all the YouTube videos of these stories are posted. They're on other social media platforms as well, but the YouTube links are embedded there, and people can contact me through that website. There are also podcast episodes and articles and other resources, and so people can follow me there or follow me on social media. I'm very easy to contact online, so I look forward to receiving people's stories in whatever format they'd like to communicate with me. That's what it's all about.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's excellent. And we actually, so we've got set up already, I think, 6 different events through this week that we will have video recordings of and that we'll have produced and stuff as well. So we're going to include the link to dyingtomeetyou.com on the podcast description. And then our viewers and listeners can also keep watching out for our YouTube channel through our Archdiocese website for more of those videos. So if you're not able to actually get to one of the events that Amanda has been speaking at, this is going to release after the fact. So if you weren't able to get to one of those events, you still didn't miss out on some really great stuff. So yeah, this has been a great initial conversation and wonderful having all of you, our viewers and listeners, joining us this week on Thinking Faith. As always, we continue to pray that God may bless you and those you love with a faith that is always seeking understanding.
St. Thomas and St. Ignatius,
pray for us.
Amen.
Amen.